we'll be doing is sending every registrant this recording after the program is over, so you can access it at any time or show it to multiple class sessions if need be. So what you're going to see now is you're going to see your screen sort of shift and change. And you will hopefully see me in just 1 second here. All right. Good morning, everybody. And I want to tell you before we get started with our presentation, below me here is this Q&A pod. And it kind of works similar to the chat that you've been using before. We will be dedicating some time at the end for questions for me or Tanita. And just populate those questions right there. I will be kind of monitoring them during Tanita's presentation. And then after that, we'll, as I said, save about 10 minutes to the end to answer everything that you all have been typing in. So today, how we'll do the program is I am going to present for maybe the first 20 minutes or so, giving you a brief overview of our special exhibit and talking about African American, specifically African American women in World War II, showing a couple oral histories from our collection. And you'll be, of course, answering questions, poll questions, and hopefully typing in questions for me. Then in the second half of the program, Tanita Davis will be joining us from California, the wonders of technology here. We're in New Orleans. She's in California. And she'll be giving a presentation, of course, on her wonderful book, Mare's War. If you haven't read it yet, I highly suggest that you do. It's also available for purchase here at the museum. She'll be talking about some of the research that went into it, her motivation for writing this book, and really what it means today. Of course, she'll be showing some really wonderful images and some historical film footage throughout. So to get started today, we here at the National World War II Museum have a special exhibit now on view called Fighting for the Right to Fight, African American Experiences in World War II. Now, this exhibit is on view until really the end of the school year, so if we have any groups that are relatively local, nearby, you're relatively nearby, please come and see it before it leaves here and goes somewhere else. Hopefully this exhibit will also be traveling around the country, so if you miss it here in New Orleans, maybe you can catch it at another museum around the country. But based on that whole idea, Fighting for the Right to Fight, I love that title, and so I thought actually today I would ask you your first poll question about that title and kind of to lead off our discussion today. So what you're going to see here is a poll question come up onto your screen. Now, we'll be answering some multiple choice ones later, but this one I actually wanted your input. So I want to hear from you all. Type in what you think fighting for the right to fight actually means. And I'll give you a second to kind of type it in, and then I'll broadcast your results. So think about that title, Fighting for the Right to Fight. Okay, some good answers coming in right now. As you all are typing, oh good, oh awesome, I'm just going to broadcast them so you all can look at them. I love this description, working to be accepted as full citizens in the sense of being able to go into combat rather as second-class citizens who are not up to it. I don't think I could explain it any better, very good. Perhaps having one's views considered for changes. To be able to fight for something you want to do or something that you believe in. Very good. Struggling to join in. African American soldiers receiving the same benefits as white soldiers. Oh my goodness, everybody, these are wonderful responses. Exactly, and that's really what our exhibit here at the museum is all about. We look at both the African American experience in the military, but also here at home, and especially in defense factories as well. As I said, today we're taking a specific look at African American women, and we'll be talking about that in just 1 second, but these are awesome responses, so I hope you're using your scroll button to check out what other students are saying. I'm going to kind of save that so I can check out all of your wonderful responses later. But great job, exactly. So I'm going to move that out of the way and give you a little bit of a preview of our special exhibit. So you'll see some images from right below me here on your screen. Now, if you all are studying World War II right now, you know that the United States got into the war at the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, a surprise attack on our Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. The next day, the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asked Congress to declare war on Japan. That happens. 3 days after that, Germany declares war on the United States. So now the U.S. is at war. This is the scene that we're setting in the 1940s, 1941. Now, with the attack on Pearl Harbor came this even greater change. The country wasn't totally ready for war, wasn't totally prepared. Another good vocabulary word for that is mobilized. And so that required a lot of different groups of people to be involved and using and utilizing all these different people and groups and businesses and whatever it may be all across the country. So in 1942, President Roosevelt, he began to issue these directives to increase opportunities for African American enlistment in the military. But that doesn't mean it was all equal, it was all fair. It doesn't mean that the military wasn't segregated. And that brings us to another great vocabulary term. So I'm going to ask you all, we're going to do poll questions back to back to back here. What is segregation? Is it A, unfairly treating a person or group of people differently from other people? B, an unfavorable opinion not based on reason or knowledge? C, the action of setting someone apart from other people? Or D, an oversimplified image of a person or group? This is a tough one, I think. See if you guys can. And I'll broadcast the results in just 1 second. All right. Give you maybe 1 more minute to vote here. Okay, I'm going to broadcast and see what you all say. None of these things that are listed here are obviously good things. They're all about prejudice and discrimination, but actually C is segregation, the act of setting someone apart from other people. And that means that the military, as I said, was totally and completely segregated. So African Americans served in all black units. There were separate training facilities, all the way down to separate medical supplies, as we're going to hear in an oral history in just 1 second. Separate jobs for African Americans in general, not based on merit or where you deserve to be or your training, but solely based on race. And there was a tremendous amount of discrimination in the military at the time. In many branches of the military, as we're going to see as we look through a couple other images of the exhibit, African Americans, they were essentially assigned to only serve in these kind of logistical roles or support roles. And like transporting supplies or mess attendants, stewards, because of this deep distrust the military had for African Americans and anything that they could do to support the military. There were a few groups that didn't serve in this sort of capacity. You all have maybe heard of the Tuskegee Airmen or a couple army groups that served in combat in Italy. But as a whole, African Americans were relegated to these kinds of jobs that I mentioned earlier. Great job, everybody, on this poll. So, actually, that hid the wrong thing. Let me get back to my presentation. That's Tanita's. Let me move that one out of the way for a second. All right, so as we move forward here, we can see a couple more images of the exhibit. And so here you can see we develop, or there's each branch of the military is mentioned with, of course, artifacts from our collection. And you can see here's another shot. Of course, there are oral histories throughout this exhibit. As I said, a variety of artifacts. So here we could see a uniform from the Marine Corps in our view. And, of course, historical film footage and even a video piece that we produced. And in a really amazing thing that we have here, too, if I have time at the end, I'll talk about it. We have medals of honor from 5 of the 7 African-American Medal of Honor recipients. Now, these men did not receive the Medal of Honor, the military's highest award for bravery, during World War II, but after that. And so we'll actually talk about that at the end if we have some time, and if anybody has questions. But what I want to turn it to now is African-American women in the military, because that is really what Mare's War is all about. And so, it's tough to be an African-American in the military because you're being treated unfairly. It's also tough to be an African-American woman. There was also this sort of distrust that people were unsure if women even had a role in the military at the time. The military was very different than it is today. women served in auxiliary units of each branch of the military. So as we see in Mare's War, Mare serves in the WAC, or the Women's Army Corps. And we can actually see in this next picture some WACs right here. These are WAC mechanics. There were about 4,000 African American women who served, for example, in this group called the WACs. Now, women in uniform, they did a lot of different types of jobs. So, of course, here you can see these are female mechanics. They took office jobs and different sort of clerical jobs in the armed forces to essentially free men to fight. They did a variety of things: drove trucks, repaired airplanes, lab technicians, rigged parachutes, radio operators, flew military aircraft. And as we see in Mare's War, and as we see some other examples too, women even were in charge of sorting the thousands upon thousands and thousands of pieces of mail that were going to the fronts to our soldiers. So these were all critical jobs to make the military function far, far away from home. And what I want to play for you, instead of me telling you all about this, I would like for you to actually hear it from a first-hand perspective. And who we're going to hear it from today, at least first, is a WAC named Lavinia Bro. She actually grew up not too far from here in New Orleans, in Slidell, Louisiana. And after the attack on Pearl Harbor, she joined the WAC. She always dreamed of traveling, and so she figured that this would be, the military would allow her to do it. So it'd be a great way to see different parts of the world, potentially. So in this clip from her oral history, which I'm about to play for you here, she is going to talk about segregation within the barracks, so your living quarters, right after basic training. Now, what I'll do for this clip and for all the other clips throughout is, so you all can see and hear everything okay, I'm going to pause my video and audio so the streaming is cooperative, and then I'm going to come back after that. Just as a note, these oral histories are always just slightly quieter than my voice, so teachers, you might want to just turn up the volume.
The barracks that I was in, the first barracks I was in after basic training, they had about 29 or 30 of us in that barracks. And it brought in a company that had just come in from basic training. And bless goodness, the women was white. And they spread the sheet, the blankets, in a rope across the middle of the barrack, and the black women laying in the back got up and one of them say, "Oh, we don't like this. We don't appreciate this kind of carry." And the others got up and they started pulling their blankets off of that line that was separating us from each other, and pull them down and say, "We don't want this." We were like, we're not gonna have it, and you don't know separation. You don't want to sleep in here with us. Go out there and get under the tree. And the girl that was supposed to be our company parent, that show you how raw our resistance was. She was to be our.
All right, so those women hanging up that line to separate the African American
Right,
women from the white
sergeant.
women.
And
And, she said those
didn't
women,
even have a uniform.
raising up and saying, this is not
Right, she
right.
got up
And how Lavinia
went
says
somewhere. I
that,
don't know
at
where.
least in her opinion, that was the beginning of integration. So we're talking about the military being segregated. We'll talk a little bit at the end about integration and maybe the legacy of African Americans fighting for this right to fight during the war. We're going to hear one more oral history in just 1 second. But of course, I want to show you a couple more pictures of African American women serving in the military. So this is the Navy auxiliary called the WAVs. That's a cool name, right? WAVs stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. And these were the first black WAVs to be commissioned in 1944 that you see here. And probably the women that were closest to the front were Army and Navy nurses. And you can see some Army nurses training here and doing kind of an early morning workout at their base in Australia. They were assigned to Army hospitals throughout the Pacific Theater. And we are next going to hear from a woman named Prudence Burrell. She is an Army nurse, and she's going to tell you about the conditions in the Pacific. So you're going to hear about New Guinea and how hot and how kind of unbearable it was. But you're also going to hear about segregation, and segregation not just being trained and working in all black units, but even down, as you're going to hear her say, to the medical supplies and to treating soldiers. And sometimes how this doesn't make sense in general, segregation, but especially in combat situations, she's going to tell you how it just didn't work. And in this next clip, you'll hear her talk all about that.
I was sent with the 268 Station Hospital to Milne Bay, New Guinea. Well, it would rain 1 minute, and the next minute the sun would be burning, and the mud. We had to wear high-top shoes, and 6 o'clock, the Anopheles mosquito that carried malaria was out, so you had to have your ankles and your wrists and your neck covered, because that's where they would bite and you would develop malaria. We adjusted to it because you were busy nursing the soldiers and worried about whether we were going to be bombed or not. So therefore you accepted all conditions. We were an all-black unit. That's when the whole army was segregated and you could not nurse any white soldiers. Well, this soldier was down there near our hospital, and he was injured and began hemorrhaging. The whites brought him up there because here was the hospital, and we told him, we cannot give you this blood because it's labeled A, Afro-American. He said, I don't give a damn. Don't let me die. That's the way the blood was. Everything was segregated. The blacks were over here and the whites over there. There was no mixing.
So segregation everywhere, as Prudence said. And that actually brings in my fourth poll question. And I'll set this up with, we ask students a lot of times here, we actually have a little a permanent exhibit about this. What would you do in these very difficult situations, putting yourself in the shoes of someone else during World War II? And in the case, I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of Prudence Burrell, or really any African-American nurse who would be in this kind of situation. What would you do? Let's see, let me open this up here. As we can see here, would you A, disregard protocol and treat that wounded soldier even though he was white? Or B, send the soldier to be treated elsewhere? I'll see what you guys vote for. All right, I think it's pretty unanimous. Maybe I'll give it a couple more seconds here. No, it's actually changing. I think there's some discussion going on in the classrooms, and probably, I know it's hard to choose one if you're watching with an entire class. It's not really fair, right? But if I broadcast the results now, we can see the overwhelming majority is thinking to disregard protocol and treat that wounded soldier. Remember, he was asking for it. He said, "Don't let me die." And so you can imagine having to deal with segregation and dealing with those sorts of protocols, and but it not working, especially when you're in the midst of combat and chaos, as Prudence was in New Guinea. All right, I'm going to hide that for now. And so, of course, there's a big legacy to this fighting for the right to fight and fighting for double victory. So actually, behind me here, you can see this is the double victory symbol. So double victory kind of in the same sense of fighting for the right to fight. Victory abroad over fascism, over Hitler, over Japan, but also victory at home, victory over discrimination and prejudice at home. And many African American men and women returned from the service in World War II, and some of them sacrificing their lives, and finding the United States kind of in the same spot. Here in the South, there were Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, but we know that they certainly weren't equal. There was discrimination all throughout this country. And segregation, especially here, whether it was buses, schools, drinking fountains, movie theaters, you all know all these things. Also, there was discrimination in housing, discrimination in voting practices, discrimination in unions, discrimination in many of these defense factories that here on the home front as well, race riots. So this is the atmosphere that many African American soldiers and men and women are returning from overseas. And they simply, say, we can't stand for this anymore. And as we heard Lavinia Bro say, that was really the beginning of integration. And many African Americans who served in World War II would become leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. When they returned to their civilian life after the war, they could no longer accept being second-class citizens. Another important legacy of this story is the integration of the military. So remember, the military segregated during World War II, the integration. So in 1948, President Truman signs an executive order to begin the integration of the military. So the military does look very different than 70 years ago during the war, and units are integrated. So those are two major legacies as we talk about African American experiences in World War II. And we could really do a deep dive into this subject, but unfortunately we only have an hour, so that's my very quick overview. What I would love to do now actually is welcome Tanita Davis and turn it over to her and her presentation. You all, if you aren't familiar, Tanita is the writer of this young adult fiction book called Mare's War. And Tanita, I welcome you to turn on your mic and webcam now. And while you do that, I actually found your lovely biography on your website, and I think I'd like to read it for everybody, or at least read portions of it. It starts off, it says, Tanita prefers to sit in the corner of a coffee shop, her hot chocolate getting cold, listening to the world around her. Born in the well-known California city by the bay, Tanita was a chatty youngest child, the last in the line of girls all born 18 months apart. In defense of her sanity, Tanita's mother begged her to just write it all down when Tanita wanted to share another endless singing, dancing, or storytelling performance. So I'll skip a little later. It says, most of her life she wished she was adventurous enough to go somewhere and to do something different and exciting. And though it took her until she finished her MFA at Mills College in 2004 to gain her courage, she finally took off and spent the last 5 years living in Scotland, singing and dancing and telling stories on paper. She had to listen a little harder, hope to understand what the world was trying to say. After 5 years of trying, she moved back to Northern California, back close to the bay and to family. Eventually she'll set off someplace else, but for now is enjoying the fog and the sunshine. I love that. So I would love to welcome Tanita. I'm wondering if, feel free to turn on your webcam and mic, and so everybody can see and hear you.
Hear me?
I think we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Maybe.
Hi.
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear. Awesome.
Oh, the camera's not working, huh? I can see it.
Hopefully you'll pop up. Hello. Hopefully you'll pop up below me in just 1 second. Hit if you see there's a little thing that says start sharing. There we go. Now I think it'll pop up. There we go. Hey, awesome, wonderful. Well, Tanita, I am just so I've been looking forward to this webinar for months. We booked this like probably in the summer, right? So I've been, as I said, counting down the days to this program, and after reading Mare's War and just loving the story, I just couldn't wait to share it with the audience out here. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to go away for now. I'm going to pause my video.
Hi everyone, I'm going to talk about the American history that's included in Mare's War. I'm going to show you a little footage of that history. I'm going to discuss why I believe the study of the past is important, read to you a little from my book, and I have the hardback cover, so it's different from the cover that Chrissy has. But anyway, and then I'm going to we're going to open up the floor for questions between the two of us. First, a little bit of background. In 2004, I was finishing up graduate school, and as part of, the final assignment was a gigantic paper, and which was going to be our thesis project. And the best place, if any of you have a writerly bent, to find stories is always, to begin with your own family. Your family will forgive you for this eventually. Anyway, my mother always had told me that my grandmother on my father's side had run away from home when she was 15 or 16, and that she ended up working on an army base in Florida. And I always thought that there was more to that story, but we didn't know the more to that story. And my grandmother was not the sort of person you asked about details of her life. She was very closed-mouthed, and she always said that bringing up the past was basically more trouble than it was worth, so we didn't ask. And we respected her privacy. But after she passed away, I thought, it couldn't hurt to look. Ancestry.com, I think, was having a free weekend when they had just started their website, and they were allowing people to come for free to search out information on their families. And so I poked through their records, and I found my grandmother's name on the rolls of the Army as having enlisted. So it wasn't just that she had ended up working there after running away. She was actually a soldier. And I thought, wow, because, I didn't actually know a lot about Army history, the history of the American Army, U.S. Army, and didn't know that when women were included in the Army. And so I was actually pretty excited to find this. A lot of research was involved in Mare's War. For me, the biggest part was images. And actually, Chrissy, would you play the little video I have of the soldiers working overseas? We kind of figured out that I can run my slides forward, but yeah, this is what I wanted to show you, some moving pictures while I talked about this. A lot of research was involved. For me, looking at images was the best part, because I started to feel like I knew the people in the pictures after looking at them over and over. I read personal letters and journals to find out about Army history, and I did find out that indeed black women weren't any more welcome in most branches of the military than black men until the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was asked to start speaking up about allowing women to take part in the military. And Mary Bethune actually asked her to do so. She was an African-American activist at the time, and it was really close to her heart. Everybody was galvanizing as a country to take part in supporting the war effort, and so many people were being left out, including African-American women. What these images are this is actually the Army's footage of the soldiers working. This is the Women's Army Corps, which is what WAC stands for, Women's Army Corps. They were in Birmingham, England, and in this dim room, and they were also very cold a lot of the time. This is where they were working. I found the images really arresting. Here they were, the 6 AAA, as they call themselves, Central Postal Directory Battalion was a unit of 885 Black Women Army Corps members. They were charged with clearing up this huge backlog of mail that had been sent to military personnel overseas, because undelivered mail was hurting morale. Because, you know, imagine, these people were soldiers. They had been away from home for months and months and months overseas, and they had heard nothing from home. Well, the job was expected to take 6 months. When the Army finally decided that these women were okay to send, here they sent all of these women, and they expected them to get there, dig in, and do the work of, you know, looking at all of this mail, digging it out, organizing it, and getting it sent to the front wherever the people were. The job was expected, as I said, to take 6 months, but they worked around the clock in 8-hour shifts. And they finished the job. They handled 7 million pieces of mail in 3 months. And because they'd done such a great job, as it always happens when you've done a great job, there's more work to do. And so they sent them on to France for a similar assignment. And I always imagined, you know, I looked at those pictures and I thought, you know, those women arrived in England on Valentine's Day in 1945. It is cold and dark, and they are wobbly because they've been on a boat for, I believe it was something like 11 to 14 days to get across the Atlantic. And they had been chased by a German submarine. They had run into winter storms, and they marched off the ship, and the first thing that happened was a V-1 rocket, one of the German rockets they called buzz bombs. It exploded right as they were marching off the boat. And they thought to themselves, oh, what did we do? They probably wondered what they were doing there. And of course, the other first thing that they had to do right when they got there, and I'll show you a little bit of footage of that later, is that there is, they had to be, go on a parade and review, their troops had to be reviewed by the general. These are people who've been on a boat for a very long time, and they're very cold and tired, and the first thing they have to do is stand up and salute and look good. But, you know, I loved looking at all of these images and thinking of all of these things, because I imagine that this was what galvanized these women into doing the best job that they could do. Because, you know, here they came. There were 3 airplane hangars full of mail, backlog mail. And they were dealing with mail from people. You know, here's World War II. There are a lot of people who's from the country whose sons had gone to the front. These are people whose experience with sending and receiving mail was fairly limited, you know, and in the country, you know, people didn't always send that much mail, or if they did, it was like sort of a once a year thing, and it would be figured out because they maybe weren't sending it very hard, but they were sending letters that were addressed to things like, to Bobby Jr., U.S. Army. Well, we have no last name, we have no battalion, we have no squad. So not only did we have these 3 airplane hangars full of mail, we had people who may or may not have had a last name. They had no idea how to get this mail anywhere to the people. But these women knew, though, the soldiers knew that their job was important, because there were people fighting and dying sometimes without ever having heard a word from home. They needed to know that they were loved and that they were appreciated and that they were necessary to protecting democracy. And these are some of the things that just came to me and were really inspiring as I sort of pulled together history and personal family history and Army history as I wrote Mare's War. Now, this novel is told in alternating parts. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's separated between now and then. In the now sections, the title character, Mare, is an old woman, and she's driving her very reluctant granddaughters, Talitha and Octavia, on a cross-country trip during their summer vacation. And let me tell you, Tali and Octavia are not in it. I mean, they're stuck in a car with an old woman who refuses to get on an airplane. It's just not on. In the then sections, Mare is Mary Lee. It's 1944. And she's just run away from home to join the Women's Army Corps during World War II. She ends up training in Iowa, then they move on to Georgia, and she eventually travels by ship all the way to Birmingham, England, and she ends her service in the European theater in France. let me go ahead, Chrissy, and have you pull up the other video, because this one is just silent and it's just basically showing them doing the same things. But this next piece is only a couple of minutes long, and this is the film in England. And so you'll see the guys with different kind of hats, or bobbies in England with different helmets. And this is the video of their parade when they first arrived in England. I could kind of watch that pretty much every day. You know, just I would look at the faces of those women and over again in still images and videos and start to feel like I knew them. And that really just was so much inspiration. On a personal note, my grandmother did not go overseas. There's no record that she left the Army base where she'd done her training. But she was one of thousands of American women who served as drivers and mechanics and cooks and secretaries and teletype operators and welders and riveters, putting together ships and aircrafts that were used to win the war elsewhere. I was really intrigued by the women who worked in the war effort, and even more so by the battalion of African American women who served. And I thought, who were they and how did they get involved, and what special challenges did they face far from home, and how come no one ever told me about them? Now, I'm going to attempt to remember to do slides at the same time here. Chrissy taught me how to do this, and then I promptly forgot. We have a lot of images, information about World War II that's part of the national sort of American consciousness, basic man on the street stuff that you could walk down, you know, the road and ask people about. They could give you buzzwords about World War II. There were Nazis, there was Pearl Harbor, there was Normandy, D-Day. So there are things that people kind of know in general. Better historians than most can tell you about the London Blitz, the Battle of the Bulge, Hiroshima. Most people could not tell you anything about Executive Order 9066, which sent American citizens of Japanese descent into internment camps. Most of them don't know anything about the WWII campaign, because that wasn't the common part of what we know. Most people don't know anything about the March on Washington movement, which was a very early civil rights march effort, nor they probably couldn't tell you about Executive Order 8802, which was, as Chrissy mentioned earlier, started to change the laws about the national defense industry and discrimination in those workplaces. It was, I guess, basically the first steps to ending racial discrimination in the workplace. And it's in part that we don't see a lot of this in the general things that we know about World War II, is because in part the entertainment media's stories, movies, still images, and all of that only show part of the picture. We don't show the America that was still clinging to segregation and Jim Crow laws. We don't show the America that was terrified of Japanese Americans and were taking their property and their land and their money. Historically, in America, we've privileged some voices over others, and that's how we did things in the past. But as people who are in the present, who are trying to learn from the past and steer our future, we've got to think about what we did before and keep from making the same mistakes, essentially. A lot of times people wonder, when we get to looking at the WWII campaign and looking at African Americans in history and looking at how things were, how come it's so important that we talk about this? Why is it something which we're putting so much time and effort into? And it's not so that we can ruin people's sort of image of the greatest generation or our image of the past, but it is important because African Americans are part of America. Therefore, African American history is American history, and we never should have any fear for the future unless we forget what happened in the past, and that's really very important. So these are the types of things that I wanted to explore in Mare's War. I wanted to show readers what small town America was like for this young woman who was, coming from a past that had, discrimination and poverty and hard work in it. And I wanted her to have some adventures and find out about the world and begin to realize what she had to offer. So many other women did during that time. And so I'm going to, I knew that I would probably talk too much, so I'm going to speed up. I'm going to read a little bit from Mare's War. And this is the portion in which Mary Lee, this is in a then section, so this is in the 1940s. This is when Mary Lee is just learning what it means to be in the Army, and she and her cohort are working together, and they're doing well at the work that they've been assigned, but they're also learning that sometimes there's some extra work that comes along just for Black women. Saturday afternoon, just after we get off, Lieutenant Hunley come by, her face looking hard. She holler out like we're doing Joe Peaches, Carter. Ma'am, Peaches said. Now, Peach has been working in one of the offices since she went to commercial high school and took up shorthand typing. She says she doesn't want to be no Army grunt, but Lieutenant Hunley has always got another job for her. Carter, front and center, she say. We had a request for you. A request, ma'am? Peaches put her hands on her hips. Our company just got showered, and Peaches in her WAC issue maroon bathrobe, getting ready to paint her toenails. I'm off duty, ma'am. I am aware of that, Carter, Lieutenant say, and she act like her face got frozen. Peaches straightened up fast. Yes, ma'am, she says. Hunley does not play around when she's got that look. Captain Jennings is in need of a sitter for General Craig's twins tonight. Their regular housekeeper is ill. He knows your work and considers you conscientious and feels like you would like to earn some pocket money. Well, Peaches looked like her jaw just broke. Her mouth hangs open, and every girl in our company looks like she's just been slapped. Now we know why Hunley looks like she's about to spit. Nobody in their right mind is going to ask any of the white girls to watch after some general's babies after 8 hours on their feet. But they're after the colored girls all the time to fetch and carry and help out. Get a load of that, Annie Brown mutters under her breath. I shake my head. Peaches worked hard in that kitchen, harder than anybody, and since she don't like to cook nohow, she's got to try twice as hard. She says Cook hollered at her all day, and she about cut her fingers off with all the chopping she did. She's tired like we all are. Peaches lets out her breath like a popped tire. She looks like someone kicked her in the stomach. Her shoulders slump, and she puts down her polish and picks up her shoes. I'll go, Lieutenant Hundley, I say. I can't stand Peaches' broken down look. Peaches cuts her eyes at me, and I ignore her. Peaches hurt herself doing KP. I'll go see to those twins. Hundley looks at me like she's trying to drill nails in my head. They are babies, Boylan, children. Do you know anything about children? Yes, ma'am, I helped to raise my sister. I will take good care of them. Ma'am. Boylan, I like children, Lieutenant Hundley, I say, standing tall, daring her to shut my mouth for speaking up. Peaches whipped, we all see that. I'll go. Peaches mutters, they asked for me, Boylan, but we both know it don't make no never mind who goes to see after those twins. The brass don't be too picky about when they're asking for a colored girl to work in the house. I got it, Peaches, is all I say. Hundley stares at me for a moment, then looks around the barracks. We all stand there in complete silence. There is something in her face that says she's got a lot to say, but she doesn't say it to us. I roll my stockings up over my knees and lace up my shoes while she watches. Annie hands me my jacket. This isn't right, Lieutenant Hundley says finally, her voice quiet. You girls, you women are in the Army. Someone will hear about this. Hundley looks at the floor, clears her throat. She straightens her shoulders and nods to me. Let's go, Boylan. Life magazine in the 1940s was doing huge spreads on female service personnel and all the work that they did to support the war effort. But I read that even high-ranking American women could be asked as a matter of course to do domestic work. Because for some Americans, it was hard to see African Americans as anything but janitors and maids and seamstresses and cooks. Black Americans had to fight to be counted as soldiers and as members of the armed forces who were trusted. And that's what the WWII campaign and the March on Washington movement were about in part. African Americans wanted to serve, wanted to be counted really as Americans. And this was a time of tremendous strain on the idea of being American. So I wanted to show Mare and her sister Josephine exploring some of these ideas. And these were also questions that Octavia and Talitha in the now sections of the book talked about as well. As they interacted with each other and with their history, as their grandmother presented it to them, I wanted to show that teens growing up in World War II and teens growing up now in the present still struggle, some of the same ideas of who we are, what does it mean to be an American, and what is it like to want to do something great but be afraid that your efforts and your interest in that will be rejected, and what happens if you fail. Mare's War talks about some of the challenges of segregation, which was still in effect, and some of the issues that people in history cared about that are issues that we care about now. And when we study history, we see just how much people in the past achieved based on their bravery and their courage, basically, and their ability to stick to something and see it through, even if they wanted to go home, because I'm sure those girls did as soon as the bombs started dropping. But I just really looked at all of them and all of what they did, and I took courage from what they did, and it just gave me the idea that I could make history too. And the good news is so can you. Chrissy, that's basically all I got. No
problem, Tanita. Should have given you the floor for the whole hour. That was just a beautiful presentation. And as you said, I think those the historical film footage. You're right. I could just watch that on loop over and over and over again. Just such an intimate kind of glimpse as to what Mare would have been, in the book would have been going through, and of course, real women as well. So I know you had some slides. Actually, I'll ask the first question as people are kind of typing some in. You had some slides about doing research. This was your master's thesis. How did you find all this stuff? We had this conversation where, now today there's a lot more at our fingertips with, of course, the so many resources on the internet. So many digitized collections. But what did you do to find out all this information?
I used books. Well, the reason there was so much less is that, here I was in 2004. I think there was 5 years between me doing the research and when the First Lady awarded the remaining surviving members of the sixth AAA in 2009, and suddenly then the Army was releasing things and digital collections and things. So what I had to do was go through people's personal collections, what little was on the internet. I used a lot of journals. I used a lot of the library. I spent a lot of time at the library. There were things there, but you just really had to know where to look. And it was rabbit trails. I'm chasing down a specific name, and then once I had a name, I could, sort of cross-check and look somewhere else. And it was a lot harder than it is now. And I'm really excited about how much is on the internet.
Now, as you were doing your research, was there anything that really surprised you about what you found out? Whether it was, I know you said researching your own past and researching your grandmother, but just in general about African Americans and African American women in the military.
Well, as I said, I didn't really know very much about the Women's Army Corps, period. And then it was a surprise not to find that they were still segregated, because unfortunately segregation that went on for forever, it felt like. But I also just discovered that even when they were overseas, even when they came into the, places like France, or they came into, England, where this wasn't their history, this wasn't a part of their world, the Army and the Red Cross even tried to keep things on a segregation basis. And they kept saying, well, you'll be more comfortable this way, you'll be happier this way. And they were sort of having, even though they were having this adventure and they were being in this new place and they were being given all these responsibilities and doing this new thing, segregation was sort of a top-down, I'm telling you, this is what you'll need to be happy. And how I read a lot in people's personal accounts about going and staying in a hotel, and where they tried to start segregating the hotels by floors, even though they were not hotels that belonged to Americans. They were just being rented by the Red Cross for the service people, but they still were very concerned with keeping this appearance of separate but equal. One very interesting thing I heard was that when the women were this is actually, I read in Charity Adams, she was the major that we actually saw doing the review parade as everyone's saluting her and everything. She wrote the book that I had shown earlier in the slideshow, One Woman's War. Thank you. One Woman's Army. She had written in that book that when they went to England, they actually were allowed to break curfew at one point, because there was a belief in this small part of England where they were that Black people had tails and they came out at night. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of, but if you have never been exposed to someone, then you are predisposed to believe just about whatever silliness. And so they were actually allowed to stay out so that they could show that, look, here we are, still walking upright like human beings, and look, no tails. They were actually, even though in our own country we're still struggling with ideas of who is an American and what American looks like, they're still being used as sort of, missionaries.
And I like that how you even touch on it in Mare's War, that relationship that Mary Lee has with that little British girl who initially was, frightened of her, but then they kind of became chummy, and they became buds at the end. So seeing how that relationship changes with exposure, and that this is, all myth, it's all ridiculous. So. And putting a personal face to that, I think that I love that little tidbit in the book. Now, what was, I guess for you, this is kind of a dual question. what was the most challenging thing that you found while writing this book, but also then, in turn, then the most rewarding?
Well, this just, as I said, it was sort of like a opening a present that just kept giving and giving as I kept finding, images and just, I mean, and we got I had a chance I lived in Glasgow in Scotland. This is where they landed when they came. And so, we sort of wandered around the city and I would just keep looking at it through the eyes of, yeah, this is what they saw. And this is what, this is where they were. And it was, it was brief the time that they were there before they got on a train and went to Birmingham in England. But still, it was just, I got to be the places that the people were in my research. And it was so much fun to keep, I would read, for instance, the journal of someone who had been in the Red Cross, and they would be talking about, they were at this place and they did this, and there would be a situation here, and then someone else's letters would refer to that same thing. They may not have known each other, they may not have realized they were there at the same time, but it just, the commonality of human experience, the things that bring us together, the things that we hold in common were so much more obvious. It didn't matter if I was looking at the journal of a white nurse or a white serviceman or a black, person who was the part of the postal battalion who was, from a farm or who had gone to secretarial college. It didn't matter. This war, in a dreadful way, was kind of a unifying thing because it made Americans. We came from a bunch of different backgrounds and a bunch of different areas of belief and opinion, and we reacted to basically a threat in the form of Hitler. But eventually, I think that what we learned through war, we turned to sort of looking at ourselves, and we reacted and continue to react to the racism and the erroneous beliefs that we, hold ourselves. I really felt like the biggest challenging thing was just putting it all together, because just like now, I could talk about this all day. And so cutting the things I left out, those continue to sort of haunt me. I think, but I wish I'd had, room to put this or
don't
that.
worry, I have that same difficulty too. If anybody's done a virtual field trip with me, they know that I take the entire hour, even if I'm not trying to. And I guess since we only have about a minute left, I would love for you, maybe tell us a little bit also about your other books. And aren't you coming out with another book just in a couple months, correct? Oh my gosh. Wow.
Actually, February 9th, in a couple of days.
Thank you for doing this webinar in that regard, my goodness.
Yeah. And that just happened to be, this is well, yeah, it's a good break from that. My brain is happy to focus on something that I've already done well. so that's been a good thing. Yeah. I tend to write books about families. I do enjoy history, and I continue to read a lot of history and dig into it. And I know someday I'll find there's so many stories in American history that haven't yet been told, that haven't yet been turned into more accessible works of historical fiction. And I'm going to get back there, and everyone keeps asking. Someday I'm going to get back there. But in the meantime, there's lots to talk about, and I'm always happy to write stories about American families, and that's one of my big interests.
Well, Tanita, now that officially it's 1 o'clock Central Time, so 11 a.m. by you. As I said, I tend to take the entire hour, and sometimes, as other people know, maybe a little longer than that. So I'll try to respect people's time and the lunch hour here. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. And I felt like I certainly learned a lot. And I loved reading Mare's War, so I hope the rest of the audience does as well. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you, and I'm just really appreciate everybody who came out, and it was fun to see all the lists of names.
Thank you,
and my
Tanita.
friend
I'm
Mare
going
even
to,
showed
and thank
up,
you, everybody. I'm going to
Green
transition
Baby
kind of into
Homeschool,
one
so
more
special plug to
area.
those
So you
guys,
see our
and,
screen shift, and we're going to
thanks
go
everybody
away,
for
at
being
least
here.
visually. What is going to pop up on your screen if you're still hanging out for a little bit is you'll see this kind of rolling slide presentation of some future programs we have coming up here. So we do these student webinars periodically throughout the entire school year. As you know, they're free. And we have a couple more coming up in the remainder of the school year. As the slide will hopefully change, so maybe it'll cooperate. Let me tell you, in April, on April 20th,